Alright folks, throughout the many eras of the Walking Dead universe, the most common forms of weapons used have evolved along with the survivors wielding them. In the early days, guns and ammo were everywhere. Police stations, abandoned military outposts, decrepit houses, all of the above were gold mines for finding tools to take out the dead. But as the years went by and the world settled into its apocalyptic state, most of these resources began to dry up due to looting. This scarcity led to the rise of melee weapons as our survivors were forced to live in a more medieval era through whatever they could find or forge. But by the modern day, we've seen both a return of old world weaponry as well as the rise of entirely new forms of defense, some built through science and engineering, and others created through experimenting with the dead themselves. So today, I wanted to discuss the most common forms of weapons used in each era, what led to each shift, and where these modern day advancements could lead in the future. But with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button, and subscribe to see more content like this. Every little button pushed really helps my channel in the algorithm. Now, as we know, the dead began to walk on August 27th, 2010, leading to the complete and utter collapse of society as most were uninformed on the severity of the virus before it was too late. Despite most Americans having easy access to firearms across their 50 states, countless lives were lost on this day as most weren't aware headshots were what put the dead down. This includes first responders and law enforcement who were on the front lines of the chaos, which definitely contributed to the panic. Those who were able to discover their kill spot would figure out rather quickly noise was what attracted them, making every shot fired a risk in itself as your entire neighborhood's population could come for you if not careful. However, thankfully, the military were quick to discover how to put them down themselves. So the following morning would see soldiers enter cities in order to clean up the chaos by establishing safe zones while defending the civilians within. Well, more or less. But as we know, in spite of their heavy defenses, the dead would inevitably come out victorious in this war. I've gotten countless comments over my many videos regarding how silly it is for the military to lose against a threat this slow, and honestly, for the most part, I agree. In a real-world scenario, I'm sure this mess would be cleaned up quick, but there are some explanations we have to work with that could help suspend your disbelief. The first, many soldiers simply ran out of ammo and supplies during their on-the-ground campaign. Think about those in downtown Atlanta. If they lost control of the situation, no backup or supply drops were coming as this was happening absolutely everywhere. Sure, some could theoretically just drive around in their tanks and run over the dead, but what happens if you run out of fuel or they get too caught up in the treads? The second you stop, you're surrounded by the entire population of a city. Second, the loss of morale, infighting, and soldiers leaving their posts. Most of these servicemen were there to protect their country, so imagine the mental toll of shooting people in the streets that look nearly indistinguishable from the living. Made even worse when orders were eventually given to execute the healthy outside the safe zones as well. Most had families out there somewhere, so it's no surprise many would do anything to get back to them, maybe even attack their own superiors as was implied with the guardsmen in fear. Just imagine following these heinous orders and then remembering others were probably doing the same to your family in another state. And third, even though it could probably fit in the last point but acts as a good transition anyway, disillusionment come Operation Cobalt. 12 days after the initial outbreak, what was left of the US Air Force was ordered to drop napalm on every major metropolitan city in the country in a last resort attempt to exterminate the dead once all hope was lost. Soldiers were instructed to return to the various bases across the country as bombers were sent in that morning. But as we've seen throughout the franchise, most of these bases eventually fell as well, presumably due to all of the reasons above, as there was no longer a country left to defend while the remaining federal government went silent. We do see this disillusionment firsthand in the Dead in the Water webisode, as the crew on board the USS Pennsylvania refused to fire nuclear missiles at Chicago on Monument Day despite orders being confirmed by what's presumed to be the president. Why Chicago in particular was the only city targeted with nukes on this day is unclear. That could be a video for another day entirely. But regardless, once the flames settled as the days turned into weeks, those remaining in the ruins of America were forced to live a life in anarchy while looting all these weapons left behind during the chaos. Some groups would straight up take over abandoned military bases while helping themselves to their armories, as we see with the Brokejaw Ranch in Fear. If some remnants of the military were surviving out there in the wasteland, it would only be a matter of time before plunderers came for what they had. But generally, despite heavy armored vehicles such as tanks being abundantly present from the fall, the skills to operate them were nowhere near as common. So unless you were ex-military or had enough time, fuel, ammo, and protection to learn its intricacies, these tanks had largely become monuments to the past, meaning for the most part, with centralized military powers in ruins, your average survivors were looting police stations, car graveyards, or whatever else was left in the hopes of stockpiling bullets, not only for the dead, but for the hostile living as well. However, as mentioned, although firearms were a quick and easy solution to the dead, the noise would risk making the problem far worse. So by only a few months in, many had come to an understanding guns were only for last resorts or the living, while turning to the simplest and quietest tools possible, mostly embracing knives and daggers into their everyday arsenals. Some survivors would take up archery as their primary skill due to its range and lack of noise, but that has issues on its own as arrows and bolts can break or get lost, while the time to reload and pull back could be too long or tough for somebody just learning. Hammers, axes, and machetes also became go-to weapons for survivors during this era, as they were heavy and durable enough to do a lot of damage without making a ton of noise. But in my opinion, the most reliable tool for melee defense in this era was swords, as they provided both damage and range for its user. But of course, there are drawbacks to melee weapons as well. For example, exhaustion from the physical demand, and the struggle of keeping blades sharp with limited resources in this world. The show doesn't usually take durability into account when fighting walkers, but you can imagine how many blades would snap out of their handles when breaking through skull. This was the way of life for most over the next couple years, as many were forced to survive on the road. But as our groups began encountering walled-in, fortified communities such as Alexandria, they were blessed with a union of both past and present technology. They had running water and power for the first time in months, and although they held one hell of a weapon stash, this didn't change the fact that guns attracted the dead all the same. Well, that is until the events of No Way Out, where the Alexandrians fought a mega horde hand-to-hand before coming out victorious, proving to our survivors walkers were a manageable threat they didn't need to keep quiet from any longer. Following this event, other communities would begin emerging, such as the Kingdom and Hilltop, who weren't as lucky to hold a stash of ammo, instead relying on handcrafted spears provided by Hilltop's blacksmith. Some rather unique communities, such as the Junkyard, would experiment with weaponizing walkers themselves to act as guard dogs by installing armor and blade attachments across their cold bodies. But this was not a common occurrence, as the little damage they could do wasn't really worth the resources needed. Regardless, not every group was looking to adapt to the new world peacefully, as others turned to violence and control in order to thrive. You see, the Hilltop and Kingdom were victims of a tyrannical group known as the Saviors, who dominated the DC area by ambush and force, demanding monthly offerings of supplies in exchange for not being killed by their leader Negan. With Alexandria's stockpile of guns and ammo, Hilltop had recruited our survivors to take out the Savior's outpost in exchange for food. But unfortunately, Rick had bitten off more than he could chew, as these saviors were far larger and far more organized than initially believed. Following the attack, Alexandria would fall under savior rule, and with that, Negan would disarm their entire community and essentially leave them with sticks and stones for defense. But you see, although ammo had been running dry for years as a result of heavy looting, the materials needed to craft more were not. So thanks to Eugene's ingenuity and the opportunity to take advantage of nearby workshops due to the safety provided by Alexandria, our survivors were able to produce their own ammo for the first time since the fall. But after discovering this revelation for himself, Negan would order Eugene be taken into savior custody and forced to produce for him, as they were facing the same scarcity in ammo despite robbing the communities blind. Which, after a series of episodes dedicated to secretly searching far and wide for more weapons, brings us to All Out War, which saw the newly formed coalition of survivors put their foot down and face the saviors in order to create the life they want to live. Although this war was mostly fought with guns and other modern weapons looted throughout the years, brand new battle tactics were used that wouldn't have been possible in the old world. We've seen walkers be weaponized in the past, such as what we saw with Carol's attack on Terminus, but here we get to see them used in a long-term wartime scenario, as the Alexandrians lead a herd to surround and trap the saviors within their compound. But unfortunately, thanks to Daryl straying from the plan, Negan and the saviors were able to escape, which directly led to the bombing of Alexandria with grenades in a retaliation attack. Explosives weren't typically a common weapon used against the dead due to their rarity, but in a conflict against the living, they were a destructive game changer. However, despite Alexandria lying in ruins, the war didn't end there as our survivors were resilient. So coming up with a new way to end this fight for good, Negan had instructed his saviors to use the dead as a bioweapon by coating their tools in their guts, intending to infect whoever they cut and assure their slow, agonizing death. The concept of using walkers for biowarfare purposes may be disturbing, but these methods show us just how extreme the survivors of the wasteland had to go when conventional weapons weren't doing the trick. Although, in spite of the heavy casualties on the Coalition side, the war still hadn't yet been lost, as Eugene had manipulated the Saviors' bullets to explode in their chambers, giving our remaining survivors the chance to win the war and arrest Negan while accepting the remaining Saviors' surrender. It's interesting because in many real wartime scenarios, technology advances rapidly as independent nations rush to invent the most destructive weapons possible, which in a way was kind of what we saw in All Out War, just on a far more primitive level. Brand new combat tactics were used here that didn't require guns, which was gonna come in handy as in the years following the war, our survivors were gonna have to adapt once again, as now the materials needed to craft ammunition were running dry as well, leaving most with no choice but to fully embrace the medieval way of life while retiring most of their firearms indefinitely. But in a way, this apparent loss of modern weaponry might have been for the best in the long run, as you see, over in Texas, roughly a year after the war, the USS Pennsylvania had remained beached since that nearly fatal day for Chicago. It was fully stocked with nuclear warheads, but required 2 keys to fire. 2 keys that fell into the hands of Theodore Maddox, an insane doomsday cultist who led his people with the intention of nuking the world, but had to settle on just Texas come Morgan's intervention. This is the only known instance of nuclear detonation post-outbreak, and although it devastated any forming societies in Texas for years to come, the damage was mostly restricted to the east of the state, so thankfully its consequences in the wasteland weren't too severe. Maybe the Brotherhood of Steel from Fallout were onto something with the whole reclaiming dangerous old world technology thing. But picking back up with our DC-based coalition roughly 10 years post-outbreak, most alive today have long adjusted to this primitive yet adaptive way of life. The Hilltop's blacksmithing operation through this time had expanded, allowing our survivors to diversify their melee weapon arsenal when moving into this new era. Weapons that had been created and modified to account for the dead, as shields are now built with protruding spikes, while prosthetics now have mace and knife attachments as well. Even more uncommon weapons such as morning stars, slingshots, and whatever this thing is have found their place in this world. But while our coalition was advancing through the past, other groups were taking what we saw with walkers being weaponized and evolving the concept in a much darker way. The Whisperers were an animalistic group who learned to live among the dead by wearing their skins while acting the part. And with this symbiotic way of life came the control of walkers to act on their will. Their ability to steer the dead had allowed the Whisperers to use them as a tactic to wear out their enemies through waves, while poisoning water supplies with their guts before finishing the job with a final strike with their mega horde. Stealth was typically the Whisperers' MO, but in a wartime scenario, they were a force to be reckoned with. However, thankfully, our survivors would overcome this threat by using their own tactic against them, and would use it once again when confronting the Reapers, a religious ex-military group who believed God chose them to cleanse the wasteland. These Reapers would attack at night predominantly with blades, daggers, or occasionally bows, and rarely leave survivors as they were highly skilled in hand-to-hand combat. But their most intimidating weapon came in the form of a wacha, a 14th century Korean artillery system designed to fire multiple flaming arrows or rockets at its targets. While unclear if it was constructed or found by the Reapers, this was the peak of what we would see with medieval weaponry returning in the Walking Dead universe, as going forward, the wasteland was about to take a modern turn. You see, while your average survivors were forging weapons through blacksmithing or discovering new ways to utilize walkers for defenses, a variety of super colonies resembling the old world had been out there and thriving across America since the beginning. The most advanced of which being the Civic Republic of Philadelphia and military with a population of over 200,000. The reformed remnants of the Pennsylvania National Guard who fought the Second American Civil War against the US Air Force in order to prevent the destruction of Philadelphia during Operation Cobalt, who in the years since have focused on finding brand new ways to exterminate the dead en masse. Not only were they armed with helicopters capable of leveling an entire community with one shot, but their soldiers were equipped with all sorts of gear to combat the dead, such as modified military-grade assault rifles and armor, brand new light and noise-based devices created specifically for distracting walkers, and what looks like makeshift gardening tools optimized for taking out the dead. But probably the most impressive and flashy form of eliminating walkers came with the construction of cleansing outposts across the country. Fortified facilities reset by consignees every day that draw in walkers with a ton of noise before blowing them sky high. These culling facilities are the only of its kind we've seen that are designed specifically for exterminating the dead, which is kind of strange considering the CRM actively used the dead to their advantage by staging attacks and blocking groups traveling in their territory. But despite these confusing motives, the Civic Republic scientists were active in experimenting with ways to speed up the decomposition process from within. But by far, the most devastating form of weaponry used by the CRM wasn't even intended for the dead, but instead the living, as a modified form of chlorine gas was often used against their other allied super colonies. This use of chemical warfare was done to eliminate the strain on their resources, as these other surviving cities were unable to sustain themselves without CRM intervention, for some reason. But although the military was successful in decimating the campus colony and city of Omaha, Rick and Michonne were able to prevent Portland's total destruction by detonating the gas supply at the Cascadia summit, eliminating the CRM's entire malevolent sector with a single explosion before reforming it into a force for good in the wasteland. This, in a way, was the liberation of America, as General Beale was prepared to essentially expunge everyone and everything in the wasteland who wasn't them. And now that these oppressors were gone, the various remaining societies were left to expand and advance as they please, including the Commonwealth in Ohio, who were now allied with our DC-based coalition after their own internal revolution. Following all of these monumental events, defenses and weaponry were largely no longer resembling that of medieval times. With the Super Colonies now active and expanding in the surrounding states, modern guns and ammunition were becoming common again through production and trade. It wasn't perfect, but clearly society was beginning to return on a rather large scale, with small pockets of civilized, hardened survivors popping up all across the East. However, the same couldn't really be said in some countries abroad. In probably the most interesting yet frustrating case of weaponizing walkers, an organization called Pavor in France had experimented with variants to create a serum that essentially supercharged the dead. But despite being shown Pavor shipping walkers from America to France presumably for these experiments, it's never actually explained how the serum was created. But from what we're shown, once the black substance is injected, the walker's eyes turn black as the serum invades the brain, causing extreme rage and an increase of energy, strength, and speed. These things are often seen attacking and ripping apart other walkers before expiring, as the boost appears temporary, which tells me this experiment was intended as a weapon against the dead, but of course was instead utilized on the living. What this means for the future of the franchise is unclear, but perhaps this could be how humanity overcomes the dead for good. Release these hybrid walkers into megahordes and watch them rip them apart. With the enhanced walker expiring after a few minutes, this would almost be foolproof as there would be no risk to letting them escape. But as we enter the farthest point in the timeline, that being Dead City, which is said to be 17 years into the outbreak, we don't see these variants present at all, or any connection to Daryl Dixon for that matter, which is a bit weird. We do see survivors sort of incorporate weapon attachments onto their vehicles, which have returned thanks to the mass production of biofuel between the various societies, and hidden weapons within clothes and accessories seem to have become popular, as we see with Maggie's boot knife. Although we still rarely see survivors wearing actual armor for protection from bites, which is so bizarre. Literally everyone should be decked out the way Michonne was in The Ones Who Live by this point, but I digress. Generally, it doesn't seem like any major advancements in weaponry have been made since the fall of the CRM. We still see survivors in Manhattan mostly utilizing melee and makeshift weapons, while those on the mainland are once again armed with guns. But it's unclear if the culling facilities or experiments with speeding up the decomposition process have continued in the years since. I'm assuming not, given how many of these things are still shuffling around. But you see, it appears the status quo could be changing once again, as it's been discovered by the Croat in Manhattan. Walkers actually make a very efficient fuel source once converted from methane. So although the dead themselves haven't been weaponized further, the kind of armaments they could power may change the way the dead are handled and how wars are fought forever. The possibilities for advancing weaponry and defenses in the Walking Dead universe is endless and diverse. From the return of old world military vehicles to the rise of weaponizing the dead, it's clear humanity has been able to adapt in all sorts of ways, and I don't see this slowing down anytime soon. But I'm curious to hear where you believe these advancements in rebuilding society will take the future of weaponry. Will humanity continue down this path of reclaiming old world weapons such as tanks, submarines, and fighter jets? Is experimentation through the dead the key to reclaiming America? Or do you think this continued pursuit of even more destructive weapons will ultimately lead to our permanent downfall? I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, and let me know if there are any unique forms of weaponry I missed, or do you have ideas you'd like to see implemented in the future? But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.